I was really quite stunned last summer when, God save us, Walmart announced the intention to become a regenerative company. Now, I know from conversations with people who are working with the CEO, they have no earthly idea what this means, but they're serious about finding out because they, along with companies from General Mills and Unilever and Cargill and McDonald's, Target, the list goes on, have recognized they can no longer do business in the old predatory, degenerative sort of way.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, Director of Cambridge Forum. Today, we're kicking off a new series entitled Transformations. This will take a look at some of the ways in which the pandemic has impacted our lives and acted as an agent of change. And it's not all bad news either. We're starting our first program today with two visionaries who are going to help us examine green growth and how we navigate the post-pandemic period and try and sustain our economic growth sustainably. I feel honored to bring together two such progressive thinkers, activists, and entrepreneurs. Per Espen Stoknes is in Oslo, Norway, and Hunter Lovins is joining us from Boulder, Colorado. Welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us. So, is it possible to achieve healthy economic growth, the kind that is more regenerative than wasteful, and one that's more equitable than unjust? Is GDP just some ridiculous, outdated way to measure success? And is true wealth something much more than worth? Well, we've lots to wrap our heads around today in our time together. So just as a point of reference before we begin, an exciting idea that's really gathering speed around the planet came into being a few years ago from Kate Raworth. She's a lecturer at Oxford University, and she came up with something called Doughnut-Economics. British spelling of that, by the way. Both our speakers are colleagues of Kate's and conversant with her thinking. Kate calls herself a renegade economist because she turned a lot of her own conventional training upside down. She was looking at the myth of unmitigated growth and she thought it absurd. During her studies in economics, she was told all about supply and demand, efficiency and growth. And environmental values were something out there, external, not linked to real life. And she converted her dissatisfaction into action when she realized that, economics is a social science. It's not a natural science, so we can change it. So let's take a look at this slide that's been put up by the generous assistance of GBH Forum Network. Thank you for partnering with us today. On the slide, she talks about, you can see the sweet spot, which is in the middle of that colored area, the picturesque area. So the social foundation is the inner area where everyone's basic needs are met. All the basic needs are listed there. And then on the outside, you have an environmental ceiling. Generally, the rich countries on the planet live above the ceiling, and the poorer ones fall below the foundation. So the space between that is the donut. So food for thought, where everybody can live sort of a reasonable level of life, good quality of life, without overdoing it. So living within our means ecologically and economically. Okay, so now we're going to meet Per Espen Stoknes, who's in Oslo. And he's going to dismiss the common myth that economics is both boring and that the planet is doomed. PE has an extremely well-rounded background. He's a psychologist, an economist, a climate strategy researcher, and an eco-entrepreneur. Right now, he's director of the Center for Sustainability and Energy at the Norwegian Business School in Oslo. So welcome, PE. Tell us about your new book, Tomorrow's Economy, a guide to creating green, healthy growth. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Mary, and hello, everybody out there. Real pleasure being with you today. And I've been involved in the climate issue for more than 20 years and also been a business entrepreneur trying to create engagement in solving the climate challenge through business and the interface between business and policy. I've given a TED talk where I reviewed some of the research on the psychology of climate change, why it's so hard for us humans to wrap our head around it, and why we sometimes end up in apocalypse fatigue. Since I released this talk about 4 years ago, it now has 3 million views, and it's time to take one step further, which is that if anybody is going to really bother, then they will need to a credible, trustworthy story on how we actually succeed in turning the economy around. And that's where my new book, launched today, Tomorrow's Economy, comes in. It's a practical tool, a guide to creating healthy green growth. But you know, each time I speak about green economics or green growth, I, as a researcher, typically get this pushback or question. And of course, it's impossible, they say, to have eternal growth on a limited planet. Or if you will, I'll take it in, as Sir David Attenborough puts it, you know, those who believe that you can have eternal growth on a limited planet must be either a madman or an economist. And in a way, this is a clearly impossibility, but being both a madman and an economist, I have a tendency to dig deeper into words and meanings and see whether we could reframe growth. Is it really one thing, or is it a number of different things? And what type of growth are we looking at? And what do we mean with eternal? And what are the limits exactly for this planet? Now, this position that growth is impossible has obviously right when it comes to what we can call a gray growth. And as this slide shows, we can see both the material use of the economy along with the monetary growth of the economy. On the left axis, you have the material extraction of tons of minerals, metals, fossils, and biomass. On the right axis, you see the value creation measured in dollars. And there's one key takeaway from this graph, if you remember only one, and that is to make $1 more of value creation, we typically use 1 more kilogram of stuff. That's what we've done every year from 1970 all the way up to 2015. Now, if we are going forwards, we need to continue the value creation growth, the dotted line, but the material use has to go dramatically down. Because by now, when we extract more than 50, 60 billion tons of stuff from the earth every year, that's way over the levels that the earth can sustain for long. We're an overshoot in the donut, as Kate Raworth puts it. Now, when we discuss this kind of development, there is a tendency to want to put blame on people or somebody. So typically the left will blame the capitalists and capitalism for being greedy and never having enough. So the problem is capitalism. Or if you're on the conservative side or the economist side, they typically blame the government. It's weak politicians. They don't put a proper price on pollution. While if you ask the environmental movement, they typically point the finger to the selfish consumers. We're just simply consuming too much, and particularly the rich. Now, this leaves us with a blame game. And I think this analysis doesn't really go deep enough. And that's why I'm offering a new type of problem definition. It's not capitalism as such, government as such, or consumers as such, but it is a very linear and wasteful economy that we built over the 1900s, not really thinking about what we were doing. If that is a better problem definition, then it opens up new opportunities for solutions. So let's go explore. Recently, a new article came out that described the material flows in the European economy, which is almost the same size as the US economy and has the same level of material use, about 8 gigatons or billion tons of, again, minerals, metals, fossils, and biomass. There are about 500 million Europeans, and that means about 14 tons per person per year, or 40 kilograms per person per day. So imagine by the time you get to bed today, then the economy would have used about 40 kilograms of stuff on your behalf. If you ever carried a backpack of 40 kilograms or 80 pounds, that's a heavy load. And all of that is wasted actually after 1 or 0 times use. Only 4 kilograms or 8 pounds is recycled or reused. And you can see the distribution down here of the different materials. This is what I mean with extreme wastefulness. Imagine throwing away 90% of all the stuff after 1 or 0 times use. Incredible level of wastefulness. Where is this wastefulness? Actually, it's located in 3 value chains. And they are the things we eat, how we get around, and buildings. These 3 value chains are about half of the employees, a little bit more than half of the economy measured in GDP, 63% of the household expenses. And again, 90% of all the stuff that goes in there ends up as a problem, a waste, a pollution. Only 10% is captured. And even that 10% has been contaminated, toxic, it's dirty. So half of the value of that again is lost, meaning that we throw away 95% of all the value of all the materials we take. Now, if this is the main problem, what's the solution? Do we have to dismantle capitalism? And how do we get out of the COVID slowdown in a good way? And this is the key where we both can solve the COVID setback and the planetary boundaries, the overshoot at the same time. To do this, let's briefly take a step back first and then see the larger picture from the previous centuries. If we go back to the 1700s, the first industrial wave of innovation got going with mechanization. It was steam engines driving, spinning, and weaving machines so that one person could make magnitudes more of products every day. And some people got insanely rich if they owned that factory. Second, in the 1800s came the steel and the rail revolution. So this is where the people who controlled the railways got the most of the money. They controlled the trade. Then came Henry Ford with the assembly line, along with electricity and a new chemical industry. So you would have the age of mass production. Just after the Second World War came the transistor, which enabled TVs, aviations, and computers. And then from the 1990s onward came the internet, along with the biotech revolution. And today we're at the end of this 5th wave, and the biggest companies of the world, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Tencent, they are now the dominant players. But now we're up against the 6th wave, which is a revolution in terms of resource productivity. The economy will be driven on renewables, and there will be circular material flows. This shift implies a shift from labor productivity only to resource productivity. So imagine the 1750, if somebody had said, look guys, in just 30 years, one person can do the work of 200. No, impossible, they said. And in 1830s, if somebody said, hi guys, imagine in just 30 years, one person can drag 200 horse carriages of cargo in one day without a horse. Come on, shut up. Impossible, they'd say. And today, if we say, look guys, hi, in 30 years, we can do 10, 100 times more with each unit of resource we use. Are we then believed or are we ridiculed? But this is the possibility of radical resource productivity. And this is also the definition of green growth, because that means we increase the economic activity in a way that lower the environmental impact. So while dollars go up, tons go down. But gray growth, that's our problem. That's suicidal. Because if we then just continue with investment in productivity increases, but still keep growing the environmental footprint, then we will certainly blow the lid of the planet. This can also be showed as a green growth compass, where we plot the value creation or the profits on the vertical axis, and then the change in the footprint on the horizontal axis. Continuing business as usual would take us to gray growth up here to the right. But if we change direction and innovate smartly, we can end up with green growth. We don't have to go to a green degrowth, which is a big discussion these days. How does this look in practice, the green growth? Let me show you with these 3 value chains: mobility, food, and buildings. So if we get our gas guzzler, our SUV, and we want to go 10 miles, we will typically use about 11 kilowatt hours of thermal energy. But if I do an e-bike, the same distance, I've used only 0.1 kilowatt hour, which is 99% reduction. An electric bus, 93%. An electric vehicle, 72%. So we can have a drastic reduction of end user energy consumption by switching from the gray growth to the green growth solutions for mobility. Food is similar. If I go to McDonald's and get a Big Mac, there will be about 10,000 calories used to make 500 calories in the Big Mac, and 2.5 kilograms of CO2 for each Big Mac. While if I shift to a plant-based burger, and maybe even a specialty made in some gourmet shop, then in any case, 1,000 calories. So that's 90% reduction, both of the harvest used and the emissions, to make the same amount of calorie for actually nourishing us. Third, buildings. Conventional buildings would use maybe 200 kilowatt hours of electricity per square meter or energy. But if you shift to a very well insulated house with solar panels, sometimes it's called powerhouse, then you can generate more power than you need. So you end up with a little energy station rather than having something that is a draw on the energy system. Not just these three, there are 21 of these potentially disruptive end user innovations identified. I don't have time to go through them all, but we're doing one of them right now with Zoom, and nobody believed a year ago we would do so much. And if we scale these from 0 to 80% market share in the next decades, then we have a chance at hitting the Paris Agreement with the 1.5 Celsius target. Now, this will happen much quicker if it's more profitable than incurring losses each time you want to get something more sustainable. So post-COVID, as the economy now starts to bounce back, driven by the 1.9 trillion Biden stimulus, we can bounce back to gray growth, or we can change direction to green growth. This will depend also on how investors put their money. And luckily, the stick here is that investors are now getting wary about gray growth and climate risk. So like Larry Fink here, of the world's biggest investment fund, is saying that investors are increasingly recognizing that climate risk is investment risk. And a lot of studies have been done on this question. Are sustainable companies more profitable than conventional or less profitable? And more than 2,200 of these studies have been reviewed, and the results are very clear. 8% of the studies says that 8% of these studies show a negative correlation. So if you put your money in sustainable companies, you're going to lose it relative to the market average. However, if you put your money in sustainable companies, 63% of these studies show that you'll get more return than the less sustainable companies. And about a third says it depends really on how you weight the different dimensions of sustainability. These studies are all a few years old by now, but recently, just the last couple of years, we've seen really how green growth companies have been surging past the market average. And what you can see at the lower line is NASDAQ, and the upper line here is green growth companies such as Vestas, QuantumScape, Beyond Meat, SolarEdge, and Tesla. Now, if this is more profitable, how could companies exploit this and help accelerate the change? And is a rapid enough green growth possible? What we do know is that with green growth strategies, a company can start to turn around to making more profits in an environmentally friendly way with less emissions as well. So you have to start with the outreach where you engage the stakeholders. The next steps is to move up to a house cleaning stage where you kind of get your material accounts and climate accounts into place where you fix your waste handling, your buildings, you get solar panels on the roof. You have a greening, then next step is greening your supply chain. So you start to put the same requirements to your suppliers as you have implemented yourself. Then step up to greener operations where you create and transport and deliver the services and goods to the customers then you start to change what kind of services and products do you deliver. You can phase out your gray products and phase in your greener products in order to keep building this momentum up the stairs until you end up with changed business model where you generate more money, maybe digitally and based on renewables with a circular material flow in your products. So this is how companies can align their strategies with a donut. A more healthy growth that stops the overshoot. One company that's done this is Ørsted, which was usually called Dong previously. It was Danish oil and natural gas. What they did 10 years ago was that they started to sell their oil fields, and each time they got some money, they reinvested it in offshore windmills. Now they've become the world's leading offshore wind company, and they've sold all their oil fields. And by 2023, they will stop their last coal power plant. They are way ahead of the curve that we need for decarbonizing for the Paris Agreement. And at the same time, the profits and their market valuation has gone up way beyond their peers, such as BP, Total, Shell, etc. This gives us a very clear criteria for distinguishing between greenwashing, which is pretending you're sustainable, and having a real sustainability. You can measure this annual change in resource productivity, just as with Ørsted, to see whether you're part of the solution, in which case you're more than 5% resource productivity improvement per year. But if you're below 5%, then you're part of the problem. This applies whether you're a company, a city, state, or a nation. So we can now make a version of the Green Growth Compass that shows us what do we need in order to get to the donut, the sweet donut. Well, we need to shift all entities, companies, cities, sectors, up into this green triangle called the genuine green growth. That's where we accelerate the transition. And how are countries doing? Take my own country, such as Norway. As you can see here on the flag, we have had some growth each year since 2000, but we haven't increased our footprint. We haven't decreased it either. So we're kind of staying put, which is not sufficient. It's not genuine green growth, such as that Sweden has. They've done more than 5% improvement per year since 2000. Also, Denmark has done the same speed of change, delivering genuine green growth every year. And the US, actually better than Norway, but not quite up there. So it's like 2.5%, not 5%. But China, they had black growth back in the 2000s. They built a lot of coal plants, but in the last 10 years, they've transitioned very quickly towards the green growth triangle. Not quite there yet, but almost. While the Soviet Union, that crashed in 1990, they had a degrowth. Their economy went really down the drain, and so did the footprint from the industry. And finally, you could have Venezuela the last 10 years, which exemplifies gray degrowth with a rapidly shrinking economy, but relying even more on dirty oil and coal and gold mining, for instance. So let me close. Green growth is necessary, but it's not sufficient. In order to have a healthy growth, we also need to make it fairer and more inclusive. We can measure this with another compass where you put the value creation on the vertical axis and then a change in inequality on the horizontal axis. I prefer something to call the Palma ratio, which is how much do the 10% richest get relative to the 40% lowest incomes. So you add those up, and in Norway, for instance, they are 1. So that means the 10% take as much as the lowest 40%. But in the US, it seems to be above 3. And that seems to be a major problem with the unfair growth that unmitigated capitalism generates. So this is where happily in the US, the 1.9 trillion stimulus is oriented towards reducing inequality somewhat this year, even though we don't know the exact results. So in order to get to the sweet donut, we need a rapid green growth and a rapid fair growth. That's how we can navigate back. So let's conclude. Our problem isn't really capitalism as such, or government as such, or the consumer, but it is an extreme wastefulness that we've built in without really thinking about it. Second, the solution is to shift from labor to resource productivity. It is more profitable now, and companies can actually accelerate their profits and the transition as they walk up the green stairs. And also, if it's not inclusive, it's not healthy growth either. So with that, I'll stop. Hopefully Zoom gods are willing now, and it went well to the end there.
Thank you. We are getting a lot of questions and comments, but I think I might as well hand straight over. I had my own questions, but since the iron is hot, I don't know if Hunter, I'm going to introduce her first, wants to come in with her first response, or whether she wants to talk about the book. But anyway, that's her option. We're going to join Hunter Lovins now over in Mountain Time. Super smart thinker, legendary innovator. She is president of Natural Capitalism Solutions, which helps communities and countries implement more regenerative practices profitably. Hunter has just written A Finer Future, Creating an Economy in Service to Life. Time magazine has recognized her as a millennium hero for the planet, and Newsweek called her the green business icon. My goodness, lots of awards. Welcome, Hunter. So you can come in straight away with this long comment that you typed in the chat room, which contests Pear's argument about plant-based foods, or you can segue into your book, whichever you prefer.
Oh,
so,
heck, I always enjoy a good fight. So Per, to some extent reprising some conversations we had when we were together up in Snowmass a couple of years ago. Yes, you can eat plants if you want, but if you like eating meat, there is no reason not to. It's not the cow, it's the how. If you raise meat in regenerative ways, mimicking the way that the vast grazing herds of wild animals co-evolved with the grasslands to become the world's second largest carbon sink, dense packed because they were predators, always moving, they eat everything in front of them, they trample everything under them, they fertilize everything behind them, they don't come back till the grass has regrown. If you manage land in this way, called holistic management, not only can you produce more animals per piece of ground, hectare, you take carbon out of the air because grass has 40 times the carbon per weight of a tree, and its roots are forever sloughing polysaccharides, sugars, when they get nibbled on. Those polysaccharides feed the microbiological community in the soil, particularly the mycorrhizal fungi and its glomalin, which mineralize the carbon. And this is why when the first pioneers went across the Great Plains of the United States, they found 10 feet of thick black soil. With industrial agriculture, it's now down to inches worth, but we can rebuild that. The rancher Gabe Brown outside of Bismarck, North Dakota, went from going broke. He said, I'm going broke, I'll try anything. First, he went to no-till. He stopped breaking the soil and inverting it, thereby decarbonizing, denitrifying it. Then he planted cover crops and deep-rooted cover crops, which took the carbon deep into the soil. Now his fields were covered with cover crops. He wanted to plant corn and soybeans. So he put cows out on the field. They ate the cover crops so he could drill seed his corn and soybeans. Gabe now grows corn, soybeans, cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, grows eggs, honey. He has a diversity of products. So he is now very profitable. And over the about 10 years time that he was doing this, he went from a little under 2% soil organic matter to over 11%, 15% in some of his paddocks. Every 1% soil organic matter is 5 to 10 tons of carbon per acre and 20,000 gallons of water holding capacity, which in a global warming world is even more valuable to a farmer even than the potential carbon credits of sequestering carbon. Gabe is rolling climate change backward at a profit. And if we did this, if we ranched, grazed animals on the world's grasslands. I am not talking about cutting the Amazon for Burger King beef. Take the world's grasslands, manage them holistically over 30 to 60 years time, according to the scientists, we could get back to 280 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is the pre-industrial level. Now, if instead you want to eat plant burgers, you've got to grow vast arrays of industrial raised peas and other protein plants. You then have to do this with bioengineered peas. You then have to process them intensively to make them taste like a burger. You now have a much higher input of chemicals, of God knows what GMOs are doing to you, of processing energy, of transport energy. If instead you have locally raised, grass-fed, holistically managed beef, go on and eat your steak. Enjoy it. It tastes better, it's healthier for you. And this is one of the examples that we put in this book, A Finer Future.
Okay.
This was written by four of us, myself, Stuart Wallace, who for many years ran New Economics Foundation in the United Kingdom, Anders Wigman, who was a Swedish parliamentarian, EU parliamentarian, co-president of the Club of Rome, and John Fullerton. John was 18 years at JP Morgan, left as managing director. He knows a thing or two about finance. He left to create Capital Institute, where he wrote a paper that I highly recommend you all get and read, called Regenerative Capitalism. John laid out 8 principles of what regenerative capitalism would have to be. And you may notice if you've followed Kate Raworth, and by the way, Kate wrote the foreword on this book, that it's now, the donut is now badged as regenerative. And this is a concept that is coming up, not just in eco communities, but by big companies. I was really quite stunned last summer when, God save us, Walmart announced the intention to become a regenerative company. Now, I know from conversations with people who are working with the CEO, they have no earthly idea what this means, but they're serious about finding out because they, along with companies from General Mills and Unilever and Cargill and McDonald's, Target, the list goes on, have recognized they can no longer do business in the old predatory, degenerative sort of way. And John has a framing very like your stair steps, where you go from degenerative, where we are destroying life on Earth, through what could be called green, what Bill McDonough has called less bad, although I think anything better is good, through what is called sustainable, to restorative. We're going to have to rebuild the devastated communities, ecosystems, to a truly regenerative way of doing business. And again, I highly recommend that you get and read John's paper. The second paper I highly recommend you get and read is by my colleague, Tony Seba, S-E-B-A. Tony says, throughout history, whenever there has been a technological transformation, which drops by tenfold the cost of delivering what it is that you want in 5 core sectors. So energy, transport, materials, food, communications. Wherever throughout history there has been one of these technological advances, the incumbent industries and often the incumbent civilization collapses because it can't figure how to capitalize on this new innovation. Somewhere arises a new civilization which has got an operating system to take advantage of this new invention. Tony says, in the next 10 years, this decade, these technological transformations in all 5 of these sectors are occurring, to the point that By 2030, he says the world will be 100% renewably powered for fundamental economic reasons. It's just cheaper to power the world with solar and wind and battery storage than with oil, gas, coal, nuclear. Food, we're in the midst of this regenerative revolution in which the cheapest way of making protein is rapidly becoming lab-grown protein. Now, I think we cannot solve the climate crisis without regenerative agriculture. So I think we're going to have this two-tiered system where mass protein is lab-grown, and the protein that most of us eat when we want high-quality protein comes from locally produced smallholder agriculture, which at the moment feeds 70, 80% of the world's population. If Tony is right, and I've worked with Tony for over a decade, I've learned not to bet against him. Just in the energy sector alone, we are looking at 25 trillion in stranded assets that the incumbent companies are going to have to write off. This is why Ørsted is being so smart and making the transition early. They can do the math. Shell oil says it's becoming greener. It's not. It's thinking that it's going to have mechanical carbon capture. No, it's not. Just not economic. But I do agree with you, Per Espen, that we are in the midst of this fundamental transformation in which we're going to reinvent everything. And in one sense, what an exciting time to be alive. People ask me, am I hopeful? I say, well, we're in a horse race with catastrophe. The science news, the environmental news is ever scarier. The methane eruptions in Siberia, the melting of the permafrost, the tipping of what Rockstrom and the others have identified as the 9 tipping points. They're tipping. And this is just scarier than hell. So here in Colorado, we've been having floods and droughts and fires and violent storms. Literally the last 3 days, I have been without power. Well, no, I haven't, because I have a 5 kilowatt solar system on the ranch. I drive a Leaf and I have batteries in the garage. So, we were fine. But this is going to start happening more and more and more. So I think really now the question is, yes, we're going to have this transformation. How do we ensure that as we spend these trillions of dollars around the world building back, we build forward, we build back better, and we build back equitably? That, I think, is now going to be the key question facing us. And with that, I'll shut up and let's answer some questions.
Wow.
Excellent.
We've covered a lot of ground there. Pers, did you want to respond to that, or
yeah, I'd love to respond a little bit to Hunter. So first, all those wonderful people you're mentioning, yourself and John Fullerton and Tony Seba, they are referenced in Tomorrow's Economy. So I'm standing on these shoulders, and I'm honored to be here today with Hunter. I'm deeply inspired by the Natural Capitalism that came out more than 20 years ago. So it's a pleasure to discuss this, and I think these 20 years were needed in order for these ideas to mature to the level where investors really are ready to put the trillions of dollars needed into those solutions that Hunter are speaking about. And I'd love to see, for instance, regenerative grass-fed agriculture take off. But Hunter, here's my rebuttal of you, which is that if I may share this slide, and maybe the gods of Zoom are okay again, I'll show you this one slide here. Hopefully, can you see it? Mm-hmm. It shows all the world's animal feeds that are, this is the current state of the agri-industrial system. And there are immense amount of corn, soybean going into concentrates that are then used to feed pigs, hens, and cows. And it's also immense amount of roughage like grass and silo. And then this lower part, the quarter there, is just pasture. And what you want is to expand that lower pasture into being more or less the whole of it. But the problem is that all these arrows pointing downwards shows that 97% of all that we grow end up as waste before it becomes some meat in the shop today. So until we've got regenerative ag going huge, we should also do this shift towards plant-based protein. So it's not an either or, it's both grass-fed, regenerative, and it's lab-based meats, and it's these incredibly gourmet new type of plant-based foods that are nourishing, wonderful for the palate, and gives you also better health compared to the current wasteful system. So I just wanted to add there that little point in there. Until we get to the regenerative ag, I would still prefer not to take part in that crazy wastefulness I just showed there. 97% down the drain.
Nobody's defending industrial agriculture, but I could throw up an equally scary slide about all of the inputs into an Impossible Burger. And neither one is the real answer. The answer is to move as rapidly as we can to regenerative agriculture. This is already practiced on about 15 million hectares around the world. And what we need to do is spread it out more and more. But we also need to figure out a way to deal with the predatory capitalists. I was just involved a couple of weeks ago in a too late, too little effort to save Emmanuel Faber at Danone, the visionary CEO of a company that was implementing regenerative agriculture. And predatory capitalists with less than 10% ownership in the company, but they were organized, they were hedge funds, forced out this visionary CEO, thereby disadvantaging the 90% shareholders who want long-term regenerative value creation and are not going to get it because this tiny minority of shareholders is going to try to grab short-term profit for itself. This is something that those of us who believe that capitalism has a future are going to have to deal with.
Absolutely. And one of the key developments that have been happening just over the last 18 months, I briefly showed in terms of how do you account for this value creation that we're speaking about? Do you take the environmental, the social, and the governance factors into account? And luckily, what's happening is that more and more of those shareholders that are currently acting like sharks and over-exploiting this are seeing that there are higher benefits even to force those CEOs, even if you change one for the other, then the next one too has to report on climate risk and their environment, social, and government functionings, because simply that's good for shareholders as well. And key to this is to shift towards a broader spectrum of stakeholders. So how do you secure the long-term value of the company by ensuring it's related to those stakeholders that secure its long-term value, not just, as you say, the short-term, what's the word you used again? I lost it.
Predatory.
Predatory was the word. Yeah, the predatory behaviors, because you're spot on. Each time a new promising scale up starts to threaten the market shares of some bigger company, they launch those kind of guys to get rid of that threatening new scale up that could actually eat into their market shares.
Well, you mentioned Larry Fink. Andy Behar, who runs As You Sow, which is a group that works with investors to try to bring salutary pressure on companies, answered back to Fink's letter and said, in your 2021 annual letter to all CEOs, in the BlackRock portfolio was an eloquent statement articulating the existential issues confronting the entire economy and global society. What it lacks is an implementation plan. You are like a firefighter standing in front of a burning house with a fully charged fire hose in hand, describing the conflagration in exquisite detail, then asking all of us to go find a bucket and form a bucket brigade. He said, Larry Fink, you as the CEO of BlackRock can force these companies to make this transition, and you're not. You're just standing here wringing your hands about, oh dear, what shall we do? It's a goddamn act. And I think this is, any of us who have money invested with BlackRock or have money invested at all need to start voting our proxies and getting active.
Okay, I hate to cut you off, but we've got mounting questions coming up. First of all, before we switch it to some other gear, because agriculture is very important, it's vital, but how we behave and our consuming habits are another question in this equation. So, Hunter, you said the process of building a responsible vision of a sustainable world is not a rational one. It comes from values, not logic. So just hold that thought for a moment, even if you didn't say it, maybe you were quoting somebody else. But this business of people consuming, buying, constantly wanting, not sharing, not repairing, which seems to be a quintessentially American thing. I have to have the newest, latest toy. How are we going to switch people off of that and start to get them to look at things with a more long-term view? I'm buying this and it's going to be for the next 10 or 20 years. I know this is already happening in places like Amsterdam, big time. They're recycling their jeans, they're recycling their computers, they're really taking this actively on board. So how do we change people's thinking and their buying behavior? Because I read something last week that said if we stopped buying in the United States, the economy would collapse if we just stopped buying, like online. So
the economy would change. There's no doubt about that. The US economy is 70% consumption, but there are lots of things that we can consume. And this gets this whole issue of growth. I think the question is not do we grow, but what are we growing? So we need more solar panels. We need more grass-fed beef. We need more arts and culture. What we need less of, as Per Espen has so eloquently said, is waste. And most of what we buy is waste. It produces waste. We did a calculation when we wrote the book, Natural Capitalism, that of all the stuff that we dig up and mobilize and put through the economy, less than 1% of it ever gets embodied into a product and is still there 6 months after sale. All the rest is waste. Now, how do we get people to change their minds? Listen to the millennials, listen to the Gen Z. The young people, particularly the younger people, are overwhelmingly saying, we don't want to consume more. We want to consume better. And they're saying to companies, if you don't give us better, more durable, more responsible, more environmentally responsible, we're not going to buy your shit. We don't want
it. Is that across the board? You would say?
Yes. Yes. That is 86% in a study done by Futera, good green marketing company run by Freya Williams, who wrote the book Green Giants, talking about the companies that will be the next billion-dollar companies, because this commitment to behaving responsibly is baked in. You know, people talk about a triple bottom line. Come on, companies are not going to keep 3 sets of books. What we're talking about is an integrated bottom line. If I can show you that everything you do to enhance human well-being and ecological integrity enhances your profitability, now it's baked in, it's not bolted on. This was the wisdom of the industrialist Ray Anderson, who discovered this. He and I were sitting together. He was gobsmacked. He said, that's not why I did it, but everything I do at Interface Carpets to increase sustainability is enhancing shareholder value. So we started saying, what constitutes shareholder value? If you cut your waste, you cut your cost. If you cut your risk, you cut your liability, you're more insurable, you're more easily invested in by this upsurge of impact investors. You attract and retain the best talent. You drive innovation. When you have this talent, an engaged workforce is 24% more productive, 21% more profitable. That's Gallup Healthway's numbers. How do you get an engaged workforce? Let them implement this stuff as part of their day job. You differentiate your brand. You build brand equity. You better manage your supply chain. This is why Walmart did it. They have 100,000+ suppliers. This cut in half the number of people saying, I will never shop at a Walmart. Now, is Walmart sustainable? No way. But by issuing their sustainability scorecard, question number 1, what's your carbon footprint? Question number 2, do you report to the Carbon Disclosure Project? The who? A group of kids out of the UK who just sent out a survey to the Financial Times 500 biggest companies on earth saying, what's your carbon footprint? And everybody ignored it until Walmart comes along and wants it answered. It's like, oh my, now 1,000-some companies have set science-based targets, which is part of a program CDP is running. Yeah, this stuff is happening for good financial reasons. It's just better business.
If I may jump in there, back to Mary's question as well. I think there's a lot of confusion in the word consumption itself. What are we buying? And also the word growth, because just as Hunter is pointing out, if I change, for instance, from a fossil car to an electric car, or from a wasteful burger to a regenerative burger, it may be a little bit more expensive, but I say it may be today, I'm saying, Hunter, it's not always, but my point is here, even if it's a bit more expensive in money terms, then in resource terms, it's much less. So have my consumption gone up or go down? And the answer is my money consumption may go a little bit up in the short term, but my resource consumption goes way down. And for us, that's all muddled together in the word consumer and consumption. And the same thing with the growth issue. What kind of growth? Is it growth in the wastefulness, or is it growth in the resource productivity? And if we have more smarter, regenerative and circular solutions, then we should have more growth. Then we should have more consumption, because that drives the kind of integrated dynamics and profits that Hunter is describing when we speak about integrated accounting.
Well, we've got tons of comments here. Somebody has said, Cynthia Knapp says, we need more accountability and access to corporate policy from ordinary investors. Please comment. There used to be a way to vote proxies in an aggregate with an ecological agenda. No more.
Become a member of As You Sow, S-O-W. This is the outfit that Andy Behar runs, and he will help you do just that. The other thing you can do is, where is your money? A few years ago, a group of us got together and created a little company, Change Finance, to build the world's first truly high ESG, fossil fuel-free exchange-traded fund. For the price of a pizza, you can be an impact investor. And we do vote our proxies. So what is it? change-finance.com. Check us out.
Okay, I'm sure that's going to be typed into the chat box for people that want it. Annie's doing a great job of converting all this into links for people. Lots of links coming up here. Okay.
There was a great question on population that I'll take.
Yeah, I was just going, doesn't a fast-growing human population, soon to be 10 billion, necessitate the admission that there aren't enough grasslands on the planet or fisheries in the ocean to support a planetary diet based in regenerative animal-based agriculture?
Short answer, no. One,
you get your chance.
Population is a matter of choice. This is the work of Dr. Malcolm Potts, University California, Berkeley School of Public Health. You do 5 things: feed people, reform land tenure so that poor people have a deed to the piece of ground they're sitting on, educate people, particularly women, provide information about and access to contraception. In every country where these 5 have been done, and in many cases only 3 of them, population goes to 0 population growth or lower. Dr. Ashok Khosla has shown in India that if you give women good work in green industries, they delay having children until they're 29, 30, 31. This eliminates a number of generations. And when the women have children, they're able to take care of them. So this kind of green development is essential to population control.
That's That's wonderful. And to jump in there, the average difference between women who have 7 years of education relative to somebody who has 0 years of education is 5 kids in some areas of the world. So I repeat that, that's the average difference between somebody with 0 years of education versus 7 years of education. And as we see this education as a kind of investment in the human capital, which is a bad word maybe, but it means particularly women getting a higher degree of autonomy and being able to choose their own lives based on knowledge, then we see, as Hunter says, fertility rates dropping. So women choose to have less children the minute they have better education, better jobs, and more control of their own lives, which they more often do when they move from rural patriarchal structures into urban cities, where they have somewhat more degrees of freedom. And there is an incredibly well-researched study by something called the EASA and led by a researcher called Lutz about how rapid these shifts are now propagating throughout the world. And we may never get to 10 billion. Maybe we'll stop somewhere at 8 something and then go downwards towards the end of the century. So it's good reason to be not too pessimistic on this side, but of course, 8.5 billion is enough, we should say. Anyway, unless we all start to live regeneratively, at that point, it doesn't matter whether we're 7 or 8 or 9 billion, because each one of us has a net benefit on the earth.
Okay, Lisa's asked a question here. How do indigenous non-capitalist human cultures inform and challenge the natural capitalist model, especially in the realm and tradition of the spiritual connection to the planet as a gift, not a resource, as necessary to enhance the possibility for success in the green capitalist mode? How do reparations and social justice models play into the model of natural capitalism?
Whew. They're a key part of it.
Yeah.
We have so much to learn, not only from nature in the sense of biomimicry, but from intact human communities that existed for millennia and did so with a very different set of values, very different practices than we have fallen into with the curse, you might say, of cheap oil. The Industrial Revolution was fueled by cheap fossil fuels. As we phase these out, we have the opportunity to learn ways of living that are lighter on the earth, that are lighter on ourselves, that focus on human well-being and on meaning, on asking and answering questions like, why are we here? What's the purpose of life? And we have so much to learn from what are now called BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, from the communities of people who have lived at the margins, on the edge. They have a resilience and a lot of lessons for the rest of us.
So if I may add a few words there in terms of the spiritual traditions and this mutuality and reciprocity and the ritual spaces that I use to express this reciprocity is a very powerful expression that I think we need to relearn in modern societies, so that we also approach what we could call more fertility thinking. In our sense, the modern word for that is regenerative. So what we're doing when we're making a regenerative economics is really learning from that indigenous wisdom in terms of how not to take more than what can be regenerated. But we need to do it in a Western language, unfortunately, because not a majority of us are going to leave the Western languages. So we need to learn from that indigenous wisdom and weave it into how we account and how we speak about these reciprocal patterns.
True, true. Stewardship rather than use, you know, that, I often wonder how differently our country would be today if the Native Americans hadn't let the British come and visit and survive the first winter by giving them all the things they needed. Okay.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Can I
go ahead.
answer the top question here, because it really speaks to the core topic of my book, Tomorrow's Economy. It's George Mokray writing here.
Right,
Growth is usually seen as more, but rather than better. Growth in terms of materials rather than quality. How can we move to an economic system where growth is seen as a better quality instead of just more stuff? And that's straight to the point. Because in our minds, you know, our, shall we say, our Christian monotheistic minds, we always too often fall into polarities and polarization, and either or black or night. So black or light, day or night. So the issue is there, what kind of growth do we want? And if we view growth through the lens of, let's say, vegetation or the earth or ecosystems, it's a kind of circular growth where each autumn things dies in order to live up again in the spring. And grass grow downwards in the autumn. It's a very different type of growth from the endless upwards kind of ascent that will have no end to it. And also growth in complexity, the way trees no longer grow in height, but they grow in complexity in their root system, and there are millions of relationships to insects and birds. And we need to do the same kind of reframing of growth to the economy. So no longer just the one-dimensional GDP growth, but rather a growth in our in the broad set of assets that underlie our civilization. So both a broad natural capital that keeps expanding its diversity, a broad social capital with more inclusion and more plural cultures, and in addition to a stronger productive capital, which includes the human capital and also, of course, our infrastructure, how we take care of our buildings and our roads, so that they increasingly can provide services while providing less pressures on the natural systems. So that's the diversification of this growth from just incomes and flows to the stocks. A broad set of stocks is what we need to grow.
Hunter, you have a word in your book. You replaced GDP with another acronym. What's the other? You had
possibly another... GNH, Gross National Happiness. That was not my doing. That was the fourth king of Bhutan, who was returning from a visit somewhere back in the 70s, and a reporter, plane stopped in India to refuel. Reporter stuck a microphone in his face and said, well, but what about Bhutan's GDP? And he said, we don't care about GDP. We're interested in gross national happiness. And it went viral. So he said, well, I better do something about that. So Bhutan created a commission on gross national happiness. They have 9 pillars of it. It's definitely worth a look. On the other hand, when the 5th king invited a group of us, led by Dr. Robert Costanza, father of ecological economics, to come to Bhutan and help them make GNH as the basis of global development, I pointed out there is nowhere in your pillars anything about economics or about business. And as part of this conversation, the king looked at me and said, Hunter, your job is to reinvent the global economy. I said, me? And this is what led to my meeting John Fullerton, working with Stuart, Anders I had known for a long time. That's what led to the book, A Finer Future, Creating an Economy in Service to Life. And so in the acknowledgements of the book, I credit the King of Bhutan with starting me down this path.
That's a lovely story, Hunter. I also have a story with happiness going way back. I wrote a book called Money and Soul back in 2007, and I covered this issue quite extensively. But the issue is there's such an intense dynamic at work in, let's say, the investor company, modern economy. The turnaround there is so high that we can speak about happiness as much as we want, but we can speak about, and we keep speaking about that until this turbo engine that's inside the capitalist system has kind of pushed us all too far. So we need to speak about happiness, but we also need to address the hardcore financial workings. So this is about the broadening of the set of indicators we need to navigate by.
So we've got a lot more questions here. I don't know how much time you guys have got left. I know we're going over here, but there's some great ones.
Roll on.
how will you and we, if we are wise, recognize the point at which it makes sense for human population growth to be conserved as well? I'm not quite sure what that means. Anyone want to take that?
Well, I think we answered that in the population growth discussion. That said, we are around the world losing intact human culture. We're losing language. And part of the restoration that is needed is of community and of our ability to have real, authentic conversations with each other. We're becoming an increasingly polarized world. We each live inside a Mylar balloon where the only thing we hear are opinions that reflect our own. And so a survival technique for humanity, if we're not just to slaughter all of each other, is to begin to sit down with our neighbors, with people that we don't agree with, and have real conversations about what matters. We know from doing this, from community organizing, that when we have these conversations, we all care about 95% of the same things. We fight over the other 5%. But learning how to have these conversations about what kind of a future do we want? What are we leaving to our children will be very important. Markets are a marvelous servant. They're not such a good master. They're a terrible religion. Markets were never intended to take care of grandchildren. That's the job of a free people coming together and saying, what kind of a future do we want to have?
That's wonderful. And one answer that's been given by some conservationists and biologists that it's not just human culture, it is also the other more than human species and the cultures of the ecosystems out there on top. So maybe we should leave about half of Earth's biocapacity for those more than human beings. And that brings the issue of, okay, how well can then the rest of humanity live well if we want to have a half Earth? Maybe it is 9 billion people, but then at least the footprint per person would have to be a fraction of what it is today. It's fully possible. Rather than discussing the exact number of people, we also should include, as you were into, the cultures, and also what kind of state of nature would that mean to see the human population as part of that, woven into those ecosystems that remain.
So I'm being told that we should wind up in a few minutes. I'm just throwing out a couple of wild statements here. I read from Amsterdam when I was reading about their attempts at becoming a donut city, doing quite well too. They admit the road is new and fraught with uncertainty. There will be a degree of experimentation, acceptance of risk, and breaking old habits. So has the pandemic set us in a good position for this, or has it made us selfish and more concerned with ourselves? What do you think?
I think a number of things. First, the last 2 years now, we've seen something very new, which is we both have the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. That's the first time humanity has a shared common situation. Secondly, investor behavior is shifting and renewables, as Hunter was pointing out, is taking over. And that also comes on top of a new understanding of government. Where would we be if there was no vaccination programs and no ways of logistics? So it's now clear that government is not something interfering in markets. It's something that envelops market and kind of gives it a direction. So that provides the wisdom, which Hunter pointed out that markets lack. So it's not either market or government. COVID makes it clear that we need good government along with innovative and dynamic markets. So that's the optimal situation we need to work towards.
Hunter, do you want a final shot there before I start making my thank yous? No, you've said everything that needs to be said. I want to tell everyone we've had remarkable comments in the Q&A, which I hope are accessible to everyone, with tons of good links for people to read up on. Things that Hunter mentioned, she's put links to Tim Weiskell, who has his own environmental program on Cambridge Community TV, has written tons of links as well. So for those that want to read more and learn more, please use that as a resource. Oh, I've really enjoyed this today. I wish it could go on. I'm sure it's very late in Oslo though, Mr. Per Espen. So thank you for being so patient, and also Hunter for making the time in your very busy day. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. This program was made possible through generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, and you. So don't forget to donate via the website, www.cambridgeforum.org. You will shortly find a podcast of this and all our other programs there. This is also being recorded for an NPR broadcast, which will be available shortly. The video of this will be uploaded to YouTube by GBH Forum Network, who co-produced this. Thank you all for joining us today. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Norway. Thank you, Colorado. And stay green, stay optimistic.
Stay energized. Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure meeting you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.